Welcome everybody to our NSF webinar. My name is Lutz Metterhausen. I'm a senior consultant for ProcessStim in Germany, and I want to talk with you about the new requirements for OEM medical devices under the new European Medical Device Regulation. First of all, I want to give a few remarks about this webinar. This webinar will be recorded, so you will have a chance to also hear it later on. All of you participants are muted, so if you have any questions, we've got a chat feature which should be on the lower left-hand side of your screen. So feel free to ask any questions if you want there. I will get back to these questions after our webinar. I can then email you, and if you've got some questions after the webinar, you can also send me an email and I can get back to you then. So today I will talk first of all about the definitions that we will discuss today. Then the situation as it is right now for OEM devices under the current Medical Device Directive. Then I will introduce you to the new requirements of the Medical Device Regulation. And then I will present you the current solutions that are currently discussed for the existing OEM products, how they can be used later on under the MDR. So first of all, for the definitions, we've got the OEM, and OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturer, and this is a company which most of the times actually builds a product, manufactures a product, and at this point of time also has the technical file for that product, the complete technical file, and they also register their products with their notified body if that is necessary. So they've got a completely device which they build, and they have the complete technical file for this device. Then afterwards, this device is then sold to different PLMs, which stands for private label manufacturer, and these devices are basically identical, technically identical to this generic device that they are building, but there is a different brand on that device. They can have different names of the device, and they all have a different legal manufacturer of that device. So when you see the device here from the first PLM, you will only see the name of the PLM on the device labeled. The same is true for the other LMs as well, the legal manufacturers. So they will also just be visible on your final device. So the original manufacturer, the OEM, under the current law in Europe will not be visible to the final customer. So the result in the end is you've got different devices, nearly identical devices in the market with different brands, with different legal manufacturers on them, but basically they are the same, they are technically the same. They will be changed just by the OEM manufacturer, and the OEM manufacturer has this complete documentation under his control. Some of you may know this different combinations under different names. The most common names are OEM and PLM, so original equipment manufacturer on the one hand and the private label manufacturer on the other hand. But there are also different names which are used synonymously for that. So there is also the original equipment supplier, the OES, or for the customer, They can also be named the own brand labeler, the OBL, or in the last few years, it was also the virtual manufacturer added for that. There might be some variations in the definitions for some people, that there is a difference between private label manufacturer, own brand labeler. The difference can be about how many changes are made to the final product and to the labeling of the product, but those are only slight variations and they are not used always in the same manner. So this is why these definitions are basically used identically for a similar combination of a manufacturer, an OEM and a PLM. So currently the situation is that, like I described, the OEM manufacturer has the technical file under his control. He produces this technical file for his generic product, and this technical file is then also presented to their notified body or to the local authority if that is necessary. And but the product itself doesn't necessarily have to be sold by the OEM. It can only be registered, and this file has to be created, but this device itself doesn't have to be sold by the OEM. What is actually sold are those products that I showed you before from the private label manufacturers. And the private label manufacturer, the PLM, they only have a list of trade names where you can see the name of the generic product from the OEM, the original product from the OEM. And you can then see in that list from the OEM which is the device name of the PLM, which is basically or technically the same device. And of course, you need an OEM contract where you've got all the responsibilities written down between the OEM and the PLM, but you don't have to have this complete technical file because this is under control of the OEM. And in the end, the labeling will look like you see here on the right-hand side. So you've got the name which the PLM chooses. You've got the address and the name of the PLM in the labeling. And it is also visible the notified body of the PLM and not of the OEM. So this is the current situation. So on your final product, the OEM will never be visible to the final customer. In the past, this situation, like I said, was broadly accepted. In Europe, there are variations for that in the US when it comes to labeling and to the registration of these devices. But here in Europe, this was widely accepted, and there was, for example, in 2010, a guidance paper released from the German authority responsible for notified bodies. And here in this guidance paper, it was described what you have to do for these special OEM products, what are the responsibilities for the OEM, what are the responsibilities for the PLM, what kind of different documentation you need to have, what are the responsibilities for every single person, and what is the involvement of the notified body. So everything here was made really clear what the responsibilities are. So this is why this is a situation that we have for a lot of products and a lot of different manufacturers. But then, as I guess most of you are aware, in 2010, the PIP scandal happened. with a lot of breast implants, which were manufactured using a silicone which is not suitable for this kind of implant, and with tens of thousands of women that have to suffer for that. And this was the main reason for huge changes within the European medical device regulations. And one of the first ones that had an impact on these OEM devices was in September 2013. The EU Commission released a recommendation, and in this recommendation they already stated that a manufacturer, so a legal manufacturer, the PLM, do not fulfill the obligation to have at their disposal the full technical documentation and or quality system by referring to a technical documentation of a subcontractor or supplier and or to their quality system. So at that point of time, the EU Commission recommended, it was just a recommendation, that these OEM products and OEM constellations between manufacturers and suppliers should not be continued. It is different how this was enforced, this recommendation. In some countries, it was rather quick that these OEM products were not accepted anymore, but for many countries, at least the existing OEM products were still accepted. In Germany, for example, we still have this ZLG guidance document that I showed you from the German authority. And this is still valid in Germany, and the common view of most notified bodies right now is, as long as we've got this ZLG document or guidance document, it is basically possible to have these OEM products still in the market, even though for future products it is hard to have those still in the market. But this is the current situation, so it is not really obvious how this recommendation is enforced and will be enforced in the future. But the change, of course, is that, like I said here, this is not valid for the medical device regulation. This is only valid for the current MDD. So that's why this is just something that we will have to focus on in the meantime. But the focus for the future will be the MDR. Because there was quite a lot of discussion about this recommendation, the British authority, the MHRA, released a guidance document in 2017. And in that, they explained in more detail how they see these new requirements for OEM, or they called it the own brand labeling. And one of the main things that they did, they replaced this wording to virtual manufacturing. So at least in Britain, virtual manufacturing is used right now, and it is stated in more detail what the documentation requirements are for such products. And one detail which is quite important here was that they said basically the PLM must have the complete technical file available, but they made a rather important remark that some redaction of proprietary information is acceptable under certain circumstances when it comes to intellectual property, and when this information is not essential for the complete assessment of that product. So of course this is debatable, what information can be redacted, but this is basically allowed under this guidance document. So there you can see there is a slight difference there to this EU recommendation. So you've got the possibility to black out certain parts of your technical file. But again, this is only valid for the MDD and not valid for the MDR. So when it comes to the new medical device regulation, I guess most of you or all of you have heard about the MDR, of course, and you see probably a lot of slides and presentations about the timelines and when they will have to be implemented. So I don't go into too much detail for that. Basically, what you have to know, of course, is that for most products, May 2020 is the date until which all products have to fulfill these requirements. Only certain products of a higher class, when you have an MDD certificate, they can be changed later on until 2024 to MDR if that is possible. But basically 2020 is the date until most of the medical devices will have to be switched to the medical device regulation, the MDR. And in this MDR, there isn't the OEM or the words OEM or PLM mentioned. And it is not intention of the MDR to have such a situation with OEM and PLM and with the technical documentation not available to the final manufacturer or the legal manufacturer, the PLM. But it is usually intended that the legal manufacturer who is visible on the label, so which is the PLM, that they must have their technical documentation under their control. So this is basically the expectation from MDR. So the PLM must have the technical documentation under his control. But you have to be aware, having this documentation under his control does not necessarily mean to have the documentation within their organization or within their building or personally available. It only means you have to have control over this documentation, and there are different ways how to have control over this documentation, and these different ways I will show you later. So if you are a manufacturer outside of the EU, you might ask how this affects you, because of course directly affected are first of all the manufacturers which are located within the European Union or within the European Economic Area. So of course they have to fulfill the MDR requirements directly. But if you are a manufacturer outside of the EU, you are indirectly affected by these MDR requirements. If you are, for example, a OEM manufacturer outside of the EU, and you have currently customers, PLM customers within the EU who sell your products in the EU under these circumstances like I described. So you have the technical documentation available right now, and the PLM only has a small part of the documentation or no documentation at all. Then you are affected even if you are outside of the EU, because at this point of time, when the MDR has got to be fulfilled, then of course for this OEM it is not possible directly anymore to just have the technical documentation outside of the EU. The same is true if you are not only an OEM manufacturer outside of the EU, but you can also be a PLM outside of the EU. So you buy your products from an OEM supplier somewhere, usually outside of the EU. This OEM supplier has to complete technical documentation. You, as a PLM who is exporting your products into the European Union, at the current stage, you only have to have this EC representative who has to be labeled on your product, but you are the legal manufacturer and you are responsible for your complete documentation and for your complete product. And what is different now is that, of course, you are also subject to these new requirements as a PLM outside of the EU, because this constellation where the documentation is only available here at the OEM and there's no documentation or hardly any documentation at the PLM also is not accepted, even though you are outside of the European Union. As soon as you sell your product in the European Union and you've got this OEM situation, then you need to change something in order to still be compliant after May 2020. So what do you have to do if you are a manufacturer outside of the EU? If you are an OEM manufacturer outside of the EU, you have to discuss with your private label manufacturer, which can be in the EU or even like the last example, outside of the EU. And you have to discuss these different solutions that I'm going to present to you for your product. What is the best solution for your product, for your customer, for yourself, how you want to continue with these products in the future in order to be compliant with the MDR. And when you've found a solution, of course, if it's a product of maybe class 2A or class 2B or even class 3, this solution, of course, has to be discussed with the notified body of the private label manufacturer. And as you might have heard, we've got in Europe currently the situation that the notified bodies are in the process of being accredited to the MDR, and more and more notified bodies go out of business because they are not able to fulfill these requirements. And the remaining notified bodies have got a lot of work to do with the registration process and all the requirements for the MDR, and still maintaining the registrations under the still existing MDD. So please keep in mind, if you need to have some discussions with your notified body or the notified body of the PLM, do that really early, because it is really hard to get in touch with the notified bodies, and it will be even harder in the coming months and years. If you are a private label manufacturer outside of the EU, of course, you have to discuss with your OEM supplier what the best solution will be, what the technical documentation is, how this is available. So all this discussion has to be done now. And like I showed to you earlier, you also need to have your authorized representative or your current EC representative to make sure that they also fulfill these requirements described in Article 11 of the MDR for authorized representatives in the future. And there are quite a lot of changes for these authorized representatives. So make sure that your current EC rep will remain in business and will remain with these MDR requirements in Article 11 because there are changes to the liability of authorized representatives, and also there are requirements regarding the technical file. So the EC representative or the authorized representative needs to have the complete documentation of the product available at their business. So this is something you have to keep in mind and to make sure that they have the documentation available and that you can send them the documentation of the product. So there are basically 5 different scenarios how these current OEM products can be carried out into the MDR and can be still be brought into the market in the MDR or after 2020. There are 2 solutions which I will describe to you, which are definitely backed by the MDR, and there are 3 solutions which are currently discussed within different organizations, and it is not clear what the solution for these 3 possibilities are, whether they are accepted or whether there will be changes made to them or modifications made to them. So this is something which is not finally decided, but I want to give you an overview and show you the advantages or maybe disadvantages of some of these solutions, so in order to help you to make the best decision how to continue with your OEM product. The first solution is to continue with the OEM products under a distribution instead of an OEM solution. So the major change will be that the OEM is in the future visible on your product. So it is not the PLM which is visible on the product, but you've got this factory symbol for the European manufacturer or legal manufacturer, and there directly on the product there must be the OEM labeled on the product. You can, of course, also label the PLM as a distributor. You have to clearly state who is the legal manufacturer, which is usually done by this factory symbol. And you have to state, when you mention the PLM, what is the function of the PLM, and in this case it's just the distribution of that product, but still the PLM is also visible on the product, and the complete branding of the product, the naming of the product can remain as it is today. So it can be the PLM branding, and it can be the existing names of the product, and it can also be the article numbers can remain the same. So basically, the only change to the product itself is that it is visible who the OEM manufacturer is. Regarding the documentation, there isn't a lot of change, because then the OEM is the legal manufacturer as well, and they are then responsible for the complete technical file, the complete technical documentation, and also the further requirements when it comes to post-market surveillance, the complete vigilance system, complaint handling system. Of course, all of that has to be done by the OEM, and the PLM who was responsible for these topics, or might have been responsible for these topics in the past, they are not responsible for that anymore. So all of that has to be done for by the OEM manufacturer. And if you remember the slide that I showed to you earlier, one OEM manufacturer usually does not only have one customer for a product, but of course it is essential to the business to have more customer for your products. So you've got the complete post-market surveillance system that you have to fulfill not only for one PLM product, branded product, but maybe for 3 or 5 or even more branded products. And you have to fulfill all these post-market processes for them as well. So this has to be kept in mind for the OEM. And you only need afterwards a distribution agreement. There are certain requirements described in the MDR under Article 14 for distributors. So there are some requirements. For example, you have to check the labeling of the device. You have to make sure that the language fulfills the legal requirements in the EU. And you have to make sure that the declaration of conformity is available and all of that. But basically, the main requirements when it comes to the technical documentation, this is with the OEM and not with the PLM anymore. Of course, the main drawback of this solution, the main disadvantage is the visibility of the original manufacturer, and you can discuss this with your marketing department. Most marketing departments will not be happy with this solution because, of course, this enables every customer to do really quick research to see whether this original manufacturer has got cheaper prices or different customers with cheaper prices, and then of course they can buy the exact same product, because right now then this is visible from someone else, and they can buy it cheaper. So this is something that hardly anyone wants to do, and like I said, some OEM manufacturers don't want to have the responsibilities and the expanded responsibilities under MDR when it comes to post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up, all of this. This has to be done, like I said, for all PLMs. So this is also something that not every OEM wants to do in the future. But again, this is a solution which is backed by the MDR. Like I said, you've got the description in the requirements in Article 14 for these distributors, and so everything is written down there. So if there is the possibility that you can write the original manufacturer on your product, and your original manufacturer is willing to fulfill all these requirements and has the capabilities to fulfill all these new MDR requirements, this is a solution, of course, that you can choose. And as long as the OEM manufacturer fulfills all his requirements under MDR, of course, you can then use this solution to bring this product into the market. But with all these problems that might occur in the future, so you are not responsible anymore for as a PLM, for example, for product registration. So you have to keep in mind, if you are a PLM right now for these OEM products, you can do the complete product registrations in different countries. In this constellation, the OEM has to do all these product registrations. So you are a lot more dependent on your OEM, on the performance of your OEM, on the capabilities of the OEM. So you have to make sure to pick a good OEM where you can be sure that they will be able to fulfill all these requirements. So the second solution is the change of the legal manufacturer. So that would mean that the OEM is only the manufacturer in the sense of production, but they are not responsible anymore for the whole documentation of the product. So they are just a supplier. So you've got to have a supplier agreement with them, but the technical file of the device is now completely under the responsibility of the private label manufacturer, the PLM. And then on the labeling, there are no changes necessary on the labeling because it's still the PLM visible as the manufacturer, and of course you have the old branding, your own brand and product name. So here, of course, the advantage is the original manufacturer is not visible on the product labeling. The main problem with this solution usually is that an OEM is probably not willing to give out all the information and maybe in many cases confidential information about the product, about the production of the product, about the composition of the product. All of this has to be disclosed to the PLM and has to be in the technical file. All the sub-suppliers of the OEM must be disclosed to the PLM, all the different components that are part of that product. So this is something where many OEM suppliers, of course, don't want to give out all this information to their customers in fear, of course, that the customer might take all of that and go to a different manufacturer which is cheaper and produce the same thing, but will be a lot cheaper for that. So this is something where a lot of OEM manufacturers are not willing to give out this information to the PLM. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that the complete design control and change control for these products have to be in the future done by the PLM and not by the OEM anymore. So this is something that can be very technical. So you've got the responsibility for the complete design of the product. If there are any changes necessary because of maybe changed raw materials or you've got a change of suppliers, the PLM now has the responsibility for that, has to be decide about all of that, has to document all of that, and not the OEM anymore. So this is also something where the PLM must decide whether he has the capabilities to fulfill all these very technical requirements and documentation requirements and responsibilities for that. So this might be a problem, but if all of this is possible, so the OEM is willing to disclose all and every information about the product, and the PLM is capable to fulfill all these requirements for a manufacturer, then of course this is a good solution for the future, and then you will be able to bring these products in the market. So these were the two solutions, like I said, that are definitely backed by the MDR, but many OEM and PLM are in the situation like I described, where these problems are something that prevent you from choosing one of these two solutions, because there is the OEM who doesn't want to disclose everything, or it should not be visible who the manufacturer is. So in order to have a solution in these situations, there are currently three different models that are discussed. and I'm going to explain these 3 different models and explain to you what the advantages or disadvantages of these models are. So first of all, you've got the so-called splitting model. So the splitting model describes that the complete documentation is split into 2 parts. So you've got a non-confidential part, which is directly handed from the OEM to the PLM, and you've got the confidential part of the documentation, and this is supposed to be given then only directly to the notified body of the PLM if they want to see that. This is a solution which was published in August by the BVMed, which is a German association of manufacturers. And so the biggest problem here is if the confidential part of this documentation is not available to the legal manufacturer, it is usually seen by the notified body or by the authority that he cannot fulfill his requirements as a legal manufacturer because he's not aware of every detail of his product, and thus he cannot fulfill all his requirements. For example, when it comes to risk management, if there are some aspects which are not known to him, for example, the different parts of your product or the composition of your product, or the different raw materials of your product, you cannot finally judge the risk of your product, and so that's why this solution is at least questionable whether this will be compliant under the MDR. So it is an example or a possibility, but actually I don't think that this will be accepted later on because this directly contradicts the expectation from the MDR that the PLM has got the documentation available or under his control. So the second solution is the so-called password model, which is similar to the first solution. So you've got a non-confidential part of the documentation, and you've got a confidential part of your documentation. And this confidential part is then also available at the private label manufacturer. So this is the difference to the splitting model. So it is sent to the PLM, but it is protected by a password, and this password is only handed to, for example, the auditor from your notified body. So when that auditor comes for an audit of the private label manufacturer, he is then handed this password, and he can then look into this documentation. It is in theory available at the private label manufacturer, and so this is the bigger difference. But the basic problem is still the same as with the solution, the splitting model, because here also the private label manufacturer doesn't have all information about that product available, so it is obvious that he cannot make every decision like he would make when he has all the different information available. So again, here, when it comes to risk management, you need to have all information under your control, and in this case, this is not true. So that's why it is also questionable whether this will be accepted in the future. The third solution is the so-called trustee model. A trustee model in the past was also, or is commonly used, for example, for software where, for example, the software code should not be disclosed to a customer, but this is then sent to a trustee, and that trustee makes sure that the software code is available, but he doesn't disclose this to the final customer. So for these medical devices, it means that you've got your OEM, and between the OEM and the private label manufacturer, there is a third party, an independent party, who has a non-disclosure agreement with the OEM, where he of course agrees that all the confidential information in the documentation will never be disclosed to the private label manufacturer, and they've got a supplier agreement with the private label manufacturer where it is described what is the availability of the trustee, what are the responsibilities of that trustee, and what he has to do concerning the documentation, and how he has to be involved, for example, in risk management. So this is then seen as, from a legal standpoint, the trustee is seen as part of the organization of the private label manufacturer. It is just an outsourced process, which is possible under, for example, the 1345 for the quality management system for legal manufacture, or for medical device manufacturers. So the trustee is then seen as part of the private label manufacturer. What he does then is the documentation is again divided into a confidential and a non-confidential part of the documentation. Both of these parts are then available to the trustee, and the non-confidential documents are of course then handed over directly to the private label manufacturer, and the confidential parts of the documentation are reviewed and evaluated by the trustee, the same as, for example, a regulatory affairs department within the private label manufacturer would do. They would also have to assess this confidential information. So in this case, only the trustee does this for the private label manufacturer, and then a evaluation of this documentation, of this confidential documentation, is handed to the private label manufacturer, so that the PLM can show that he has got the information either directly available or at least assessed by someone who has the capability to assess this documentation. So when it comes to these issues for the other two proposed models, the difference here is, like I said, the trustee is seen as part of the organization of the PLM, and he can also be involved, for example, when it comes to risk management decisions, because they have the knowledge about this confidential part, and then they can either directly give a response with that knowledge of this confidential part, or if there's any doubt, they can hand over certain requests to the original equipment manufacturer, for example, when it comes to certain risks regarding the device, regarding, for example, raw materials. So this then should be covered by either the trustee or handed over to the OEM and then given back by the trustee. But again, here the compliance, the MDR compliance, will have to be seen. It is not currently. It is not yet described in any guidance document. For example, it is also described by the BVMed, the German Medical Device Manufacturer Association, as one other solution. and currently also Maytag Europe is working on a description of this solution to make sure that this will be available in the future. But this is something which is not documented right now and not described in any guidance document right now. But this is currently a situation which is worked on to have it directly described and have a more clear situation available for all customers and for all notified bodies as well. The trustee can, of course, support in different ways. So there is the possibility, of course, to manage the technical documentation. The trustee can make an assessment and should make an assessment of the technical documentation regarding the MDR requirements. It is also possible, of course, to make some changes or amendments to the technical documentation if that is necessary and not fulfilled yet. So the MDR requirements are not fulfilled. The trustee is involved in communication with notified bodies and competent authorities and can be also involved when it comes to audits, for example, or requests for review of technical documentation. And the trustee can be the interface between the OEM and the PLM when it comes to design control and change control topics. And the OEM only has to be involved when the solution is not clear. Then the OEM might have to step in. So what is the benefit for the private label manufacturer in this trustee model? So the private label manufacturer has got an independent third party and also independent of the notified body who checks the documentation regarding this regulatory requirement. So you can be quite sure that this documentation fulfills these requirements, and you don't have to rely like it is right now on the word of your OEM supplier that this documentation is complete and fulfills all the requirements, but you will get an assessment which states whether this is fulfilled or what the gaps are and how these gaps can be filled. The technical documentation is then safely stored and protected against destruction and manipulation or deletion. And the trustee can also support when it comes to audits or review of the technical file or other requests from authorities or notified bodies when it comes to documentation. So you've got a different support for that. For the original equipment manufacturer, of course, the main advantage is the intellectual property doesn't have to be disclosed to your customer, to your private label manufacturer. So this information is kept secret, and under this NDA, it is made sure that this will never be disclosed. The OEM is also supported by the trustee, and in order to correct gaps that are identified in the documentation, and the OEM manufacturer doesn't need more QM or RA resources for constant contact with the PLM when it comes to audits, when it comes to design control or change control topics or general documentation topics. So this is done then by the trustee. This trustee model is something that is currently developed ProcessStim is one of some companies that working on this solution. Some notified bodies are said to be working on such a service as well. But like I said, not everyone is willing to disclose all his documentation directly to the notified body or someone of the notified body. So that's why we are a independent third party to help you with this solution. And within ProcessStim, for example, there are different possibilities to support you. So we can create the tech file as a service. We can create a complete technical documentation file, which is MDR compliant, or we can update certain parts of the file, or we can make sure that an MDD compliant file will be changed and will be modified in order to fulfill MDR requirements. We've got departments focusing on clinical evaluation, which can be completely done by us. We've got a lot of experience about risk management. We are part of the ISO committee for the risk management standard. So this risk management file can be updated. We do a lot of supplier audits, so the PLM, for example, can be supported when it comes to audits of the supplier. And here also under this trustee model, it is easier to do such an audit because, again, the complete content of the file and the complete confidential information can be visible to the trustee, to ProcessStim in that example, which will not be disclosed to a PLM. So this is an advantage to do these supplier audits by an external party. And also the post-market surveillance requirements under MDR, as you know, are a lot more than before. So this is also something where we have got a lot of experience, how to set up a post-market surveillance process and to make sure that all different aspects of PMS are covered. So what would be your next steps if you are an OEM manufacturer and you've got some of these situations right now? If you haven't done so far, you have to identify your current OEM products and your OEM customers, so the private label manufacturers, and make sure that you've got all the details available. Then you should define your confidential information and make sure and decide what kind of information you want to disclose to the PLM and what kind of information you don't want to disclose. Next, you should discuss and decide about the future setup. So these different solutions that I showed to you, you have to decide for yourself, and then afterwards discuss this with your PLM and make sure that this PLM has the same solution and you can find a common solution. And of course, if you've got a notified body involved as well, you need to discuss this with him as well. And like I said before, because the notified bodies are really busy right now, you have to involve him really early. So if you need to change the legal manufacturer, it is really necessary. You have to plan your recertification audit for the MDD in order to make sure that you've got your certifications available as long as possible. and you have to plan your MDR audit to make sure that in 2020 you are certified under MDR, and you have to schedule the migration of these product families to the MDR certificate afterwards, after 2020. If you are a private label manufacturer, it is comparable. So you should identify your OEM products if you haven't done so far. Discuss all of that with your OEM supplier and make sure that you talk with him about the complete availability of the technical documentation. Make sure that it is really possible that you get the complete documentation and nothing is missing and nothing is hidden and nothing is blacked out in the documentation, because, like I said, this is something that will not be accepted in the future. And promises are one thing of your supplier, but please make sure that these promises are kept. Make sure that they send you all the documentation and you assess all the documentation. Then discuss this setup with your OEM supplier to find a setup which is proof for the MDR. And here as well, involve your notified body as early as possible for the same topics. So if you have to change the legal manufacturer for a product or do the recertification or the MDR audit or the scheduling of the switch of the certificates, make sure that this is available for your notified body as early as possible, and you involve him as early as possible. Good. So these are all the information that I wanted to discuss with you today and show to you today. Like I said before, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me those questions afterwards. All other questions that you typed in the chat feature, I will be able to follow up with those questions afterwards as well. And if you've got other questions regarding OEM topics and possible solutions in the future, and this trustee model, please get in touch with me. And you can see my email address here. And so if you have any questions for that, please let me know. And otherwise, thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for your interest in this topic. And thank you very much for attending this webinar.